Good afternoon. My name is Larry Eugene Martin. The Eugene is, I think, because my mother was bored and she wanted me to have three names. Larry Eugene Martin. I rarely use Eugene. A little bit about myself. I've lived in Baldwin County some 40 years. Originally, I'm from Gwinnett County. I'm a member of Flag Chapel Baptist Church. And I got involved in storytelling from a friend who I've always admired her fascinating stories, Miss Harriet Davis. So she approached me one day about doing a story. And up until then, I didn't think anything that I did in my life was worth telling about. Some of them I didn't want to tell about. So I'm going to do a couple of stories today. One is actually a poem, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the first story I'm going to do is I'm dedicating that to all the teachers who are in quarantine right now. And it reminded me of one of my teachers, Mrs. Lucy Maddox, who was a sociology teacher. And the name of the story is called Nap Time. Well, on occasion, everyone has had the opportunity or tend to fall asleep or daydream. Some even do it in their classrooms, like myself. I took it to a new level, and I actually would lower my head down and actually go to sleep and dream. I've always been a good student with good behavior and good grades. Now, my first recollection at my attempt at a sleep study was at Bailey Johnson School in Alpharetta, Georgia. I was in Miss Daniels' class. I was an eager, ready to go fourth grader. But there was just something about Miss Daniels' class. About halfway through, not just on certain days, but every day, I felt like it was time for me to take a nap. Now, some people would say my equilibrium was just off. Some people could say, well, maybe you just didn't go to sleep at night. I don't know what the real reason was. It's just the fact that my body said it was time to lower your head and go to sleep. One particular day in Ms. Daniels' class, I was sleeping. And I was sleeping good. If you ever just put your head down on your desk and just go to sleep, man, I tell you, that's some of the best sleep. C.D. Posturepedic doesn't have nothing on a good desk on a Sunday afternoon in class. As I was sitting there, I noticed as you go to wake up, and all of you who've done this, you kind of wake up slowly. You don't just all of a sudden jump up. You kind of move your head to side so you can hear what's going on. In other words, get your wits about you. It's kind of like waking up. And so it was kind of quiet. Nobody was saying anything. The kids weren't talking as they usually do. We had a pretty talkative class. So that seemed strange to me that no one was talking. Miss Daniels wasn't even up at the board writing stuff on the board for us to remember for tomorrow. And all of a sudden I raised my head up. I felt a little more comfortable doing that. And everybody started laughing. And I couldn't, why is everybody laughing? Did I miss the joke? I didn't hear anybody, and all of a sudden, one of my classmates walked up to me and said, Miss Daniels wants you to take a look. He gave me the mirror, put the mirror in front of me, and to my surprise, my whole face and hair was covered with chalk. Miss Daniels had let the students throw the chalkboard erasers at me while I was asleep. That means I was sleeping pretty hard. So after that, I vowed never to go to sleep in class again. Well, I was in the fourth grade. In the fourth grade, you tell yourself stuff you don't really mean and you don't really adhere to. So now, fast forward to, I'm a sophomore in high school, Mrs. Lucy Maddox. She taught us sociology and psychology. Not the most exciting subjects in the world. However, I was still a good student. And every day, I would walk in Miss Lucy Maddox's class. And I'd ask her if I could have the seat by the door. The reason you want the seat by the door is that when the bell rings, you can get up and dart in the hall, and that will give you a couple of extra minutes until the late bell rings so you can get into trouble if you needed to. So here I am in my usual spot by the door, and I was going to sleep in Miss Maddox's class on a regular basis. In fact, she could have brought researchers in there and really got a great sleep study just on my activity alone. So this one particular day, and before I tell you this part, Miss Maddox never said much to me. Like I said, I was a good student. I had a B average in there. My behavior was immaculate. How couldn't it be? I was asleep most of the time. This particular day, as I usually do, I had been into a really deep sleep. And I was dreaming. Excuse me. And sometimes when you dream, you talk. You know, I didn't know I'd been talking in Miss Maggs's class. And that was the reason she wasn't saying anything. So as I did my usual wake up, head side to side, you know, kind of raised my head a little bit. But this particular day I had been slobbering, which tells me I was in a deep sleep. So I put my hand over my mouth and I kind of wiped my mouth clean and I raised up. And as I raised up, Miss Maggs was right there in my face. And I went back and I'm like, Miss Maggs, what are you doing? You know? And she looked at me and she looked at me and she never said a word. And I said again, Miss Maggs, what are you doing? And she said to me, Larry, I'm amazed. And I said, Miss Maggs, what are you talking about? She said, Larry, we heard everything but the girl's last name. And the class just erupted in laughter. And I can promise you, and I've told Miss Maggs this over the years, I went through 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, college, and from that day to this one, I can promise you I have never, ever fallen asleep in anyone else's classroom again. And that's my tribute to all you teachers out there. So when you find a kid that's sleeping in your class, you know, don't interrupt him. You might find out something about him that you didn't know. Thank you.
My name is Jeanette Waddell, and I'd like to share a story with you, how cats came inside. The way things are now isn't always the way things were. At one time, the cat that we see stretched out in front of our fireplace or lying on our bed was a wild animal that hunted for a living. Now, this was a long time ago, and things were quite different back then. But Cat had a fellow cat that she hunted with. And they would slink through the grass quietly and find their prey and pounce. Well, one day, just as they were about to pounce, they both heard a loud roar. And when Cat looked around, her hunting partner was long gone. And she thought to herself, I thought he was the strongest of all, but maybe this lion is the strongest of all. So Cat persuaded Lion to let her hunt with him. And so they were great hunting partners. Cat was never hungry, and she felt safe at night. But then one day, as they were out hunting, Cat saw this huge animal with a long trunk and big ears and legs that were the size of tree trunks. And that huge animal lifted up his trunk and blared so loud that for a moment, Cat was deaf. And when she looked around, Lion was long gone, and Cat looked up and thought, this must be the strongest of all. And she persuaded Elephant to let her ride on top of his head between those big ears, and Cat became the lookout. But one day, as they were walking through the forest, Cat looked up, and she saw a creature she had never seen before. He was not like any of the other animals. He was tall, the small head, and 2 long arms, and 2 legs, and he was holding what looked like a stick. And he looked at Elephant and fired, and the sound was deafening. Well, Elephant took off so fast that Cat fell off of his head and landed in the brush. Well, Cat sat quietly and watched. And as man walked away, Cat thought this truly must be the strongest of all. So she followed man home, climbed up into the rafters of his house, and there she was, sleek and fat and content. There were more than enough mice to keep her full, and she felt safe. And at night, Cat would sleep soundly warmed by the heat from the fireplace that drifted up into the rafters. But then one morning, Cat heard loud voices. There was a very high voice, and then a much lower voice, and the voices went back and forth and back and forth, and soon the door of the house opened and someone tumbled out. And Cat looked down, and there was the man lying on the ground, and standing above him with her hands on her hips and pointing at him was someone else that looked exactly like him, except with more hair and more curves. Well, Cat looked at what was happening, and she thought, now that truly is the strongest of all. Well, Cat came down from the rafters, went inside, stretched out by the fireplace, and there you will still find her. Thank you.
My name is Mary Frances Binnicker Purcell, and I am a lover of words, and I love to write. The piece that I brought today, there are several of them. They're mainly about my family. The picture that you have is of my father, Charles Hobart Binnicker, and I want to read something that I wrote about him a few years ago. It's called Memories of the Best Damn Job. I was angry at first, December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, the loss, the insanity. Even though Daddy was too old to march, he fought his way, tearing down firewalls and ships torpedoed or burned, then rebuilding them and making them safe and secure. The best damn job you'll ever see, he was known to have boasted. Long hours, hard work, and little children at home to kiss and hug gave him impetus. Sometimes there were no tires for the old car loaded down with civilian workers headed to Charleston for a week of work, boarding their bodies and biding their time until the weekends came along. They helped collect aluminum pots for the war effort, and they bought war bonds to help the fighting men. Where they drank black coffee and ate stale sandwiches, they read signs like, "Use less sugar and stir like hell. We don't mind the noise." While they stared at pictures of other men's families and thought about their own. They did without shoes, using cardboard inside, their old ones instead. There was no butter for the tables, nor stockings for the ladies, but they made do. And when victory came and it was too long in the coming, the women who had worked in the plants went home to put on aprons while the men straggled home, some to work the fields, others like my daddy would never work again. He cooked, cleaned the house, washed our clothes, and pinched our pennies, but he never complained. As a teenager doing without, I raged at the man I loved. Can't you blame somebody? With tears in his eyes, his arms around my shoulders, and his blood in my veins, he calmly answered, "There's no one to blame. We did what we had to do. No one took nothing from me. When you're old enough to understand, you'll see I gave it." Years after this confrontation, when the asbestos had wrung the last breath from his lungs, the 4 remaining Binnickers, my mother, my 2 sisters, and I, huddled together on a bluff overlooking Bull River and strained the seams of our hearts as we placed the tired bones beneath the Georgia soil. And we knew without a doubt we could boast of him, that he had given us his all, his life, and he had been right, because it was the best damn job we would ever see. Tribute to my father.
My name is Harriet Davis. I'm a resident here in Milledgeville. and I'm a writer, hopefully, I think, and a storyteller. And one of my stories is called The Last Ride, and that's the story I'm going to do for you today. After weighing all the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages, I relocated 30 years ago. Leaving behind the big, cold city life of Los Angeles, instead I opted for a small, family-oriented city in the heart of Georgia, Milledgeville. Now, my father thought it his duty to see my family safely relocated south. So, Dad, my 5-pound Chihuahua, and I, we led off in a 40-foot Ryder rented moving van. My husband and my 3 sons followed in our car. California, Arizona, New Mexico were uneventful. And as I sat looking at the bland scenery of the desert of Texas, out of boredom, I asked my father, I said, Daddy, how did you and Mama meet? And except for the steady hum of the motor, there was absolute silence. Now, we were only 2.5 to 3 feet apart in the cab of that truck, so I know he heard me. So after a while, I asked him again. I said, Daddy, how? And he yelled. He said, I heard you the first time. He barked at me. Now, I leaned a little closer to my door on my side, again watching the Texas landscape. My dad had hurt my feelings. He knew I was sensitive. But my father stared straight ahead, hands tightly gripping the wheel, jaw twitching, and I thought, I've really done it this time. Here I am locked in the cab of this truck with my father with at least 2, maybe 3,000 more miles to go. Suddenly, Georgia seemed like it was as far away as the moon. But after about 20 long, silent miles, my dad took a deep breath and he said ever so softly, you know I was in prison when I met your mama. Now, I knew my father had served time in prison and I knew why, but I didn't know he had met my mama in prison, and I thought, what the heck was mama doing in prison? But I looked at my dad, back out that window. I looked back at my dad, back out that window again. See, I knew it would do no good to try and hurry my father because he did everything in his own sweet time. But over the next 100 miles, my father slowly told Bob and I his story. Now, I knew my father had served time for murder. But see, back in the 40s, he was a boxer. He was known by the name of Little George, and he was good. I knew he was good because, see, he had taught me, his only daughter, to fight, and I was good too. I had a mean right hook. I was undefeated myself. But during one of my father's fights, his opponent died from a blow to the head. Now, thus, my father was charged with manslaughter. Thus, he ended up in prison. Now, this was in the early 40s. He served 7 years. Now, my father's cellmate, Big Money Jake, was married. And Jake's wife, Mary, came to visit Jake monthly. And she would often, it was a long ride way out in the country where the prison was. She would often bring her roommate along to keep her company during this long ride. And when I heard that, I took a deep breath. My mother had only been visiting. She was not serving time. But Big Money Jake saw no reason why my mother, who was patiently waiting for Mary on the outside, shouldn't come in and visit my father, who was impatiently doing time on the inside. Now, my father thought it was a good idea also, but my mother didn't. She didn't want to meet no convict, no matter the fact that he had killed accidentally. And it took 3 months to convince my mother to come in and visit with my father. My father looked at me and he smiled as he continued. That night before our first meeting, he said, I got a haircut. He said, I took a long shower. And the next morning, I did a close shave. And he said, I nicked my face right here and here. And when he said that, he turned to show me the 2 places where he had nicked his face all those many, many years ago. And I yelled at him. I said, Daddy, put your hands back on the wheel and look where you're going. But he looked far off as he continued. That morning, he said, I put on my starched black and white pants and shirt. He said, my pants had a razor sharp crease to them, he said. And my shoes had a spit shine. He said, I knew I was looking good. He said, but I was so nervous. He said, I was so nervous that I was pacing back and forth in my little cell. Back and forth. And finally, Big Money Jake told me, boy, if you don't sit down, I'm going to knock you down. He said, but Harriet, I couldn't sit. I just couldn't sit still. I was so nervous. He said, I thought, what if she didn't like me? What if she never came back? But since I'm telling you this story, it's evident that my mother did like something about my father, for she returned many, many times. And my dad continued with, she was something, your mama. She smelled like lavender, and she looked so good. And her hair and her face were beautiful, and her dress was perfect, and she acted like a lady with class. She had a lacy white handkerchief which she kept twirling in her hand. And he said, I'll have to admit, I was smitten with your mama. And when he said that, I looked off. I couldn't look at him because I had to smile. I laughed. How could a man as macho as my dad use a word like smitten? And I wished at that moment that I had taken the time to ask my mother what she thought of my father and their first meeting. But that window of opportunity was closed because I had lost my mother 5 years earlier to cancer. But after I was trying to picture that meeting, I wasn't disappointed because after a lengthy silence, thinking my dad finished with the story of how they had met, he continued with Lil Babe. Now my mother's name was Aretha, but his pet name for her was Lil Babe. He said Lil Babe told me that she had tried on 5 dresses before she found the perfect one she thought was perfect for that occasion. She said she couldn't, her hair wouldn't do right. And she said that she ruined 2 pairs of stockings. Her hands were so sweaty, thus the reason for her carrying the handkerchief. And she had a bad case of the hiccups. My dad continued, and you know, I still got that effect on women. He said, I make them nervous. And you know what else? You look, and sometimes you act just like your mother. And I thought that a compliment, for my mother had been, she was indeed beautiful, both inside and out. And whenever I think of Texas, or I see a big old yellow rider moving van, I think of that last ride my dad and I took together. You see, I lost my dad 2 years after moving to Milledgeville. And of all the conversations we had in my 42 years of life, that ride through Texas will forever remain with me. My dad, he was right. Even though he's been gone 28 years now, when I think, I get excited. My hands get sweaty. and sometimes I even get the hiccups. Yeah, my dad was right. He still has that effect